Growing up in the 80s and the very early 90s as a young lad from North Yorkshire, I almost never heard any famous person who sounded like me. Everyone I would see on the TV was either a kind of posh southerner with a neutral or Queen's English accent, or they were an American. It was the same when my parents would watch the news. It was the same when I would watch the cartoons. As I got older and got into bands and began discovering more music, it was still the same story. They were all from London and the South East, or they were Americans. And it wasn't just that they didn't sound like me. The things they sang about meant nothing to the world I lived in either. Even homegrown British bands at that time filled their songs with cliched American stuff about, hitching a freight train down to Memphis or some other bollocks that they'd never actually done in their lives. And what that meant in reality was one or two cultures were being glorified and romanticised, while the world in which I lived was kind of sidelined and considered second rate. It had been that way in the UK for many decades. A large proportion of celebrities in the 60s, 70s and 80s came from Northern England or Northern Ireland or Wales or Scotland, but they had to lose their regional accents to be accepted in the mainstream. They also had to kind of disown and ridicule their own working class roots. They had to sound and act like middle class southerners in order to be accepted. Did you know that half of Monty Python were northerners? You'd never realise it from their Oxbridge accents and the multiple sketches they both wrote and performed, ridiculing the places they actually came from. Did you know Jeremy Clarkson is from Yorkshire? So is Patrick Stewart, so is Judi Dench. But you'd never know it to listen to any of them, because all of them found fame in a time when if you didn't sound and act like a middle-class southerner, you were shut out of the land of opportunity. There were occasional exceptions to this rule. Morecambe and Wise were fantastic entertainers who still talked like northerners. The Beatles were perhaps one of the biggest examples, but they really were the exception rather than the rule.
We were the first working class singers that stayed working class and pronounced it. Didn't try and change our accents, which in England were looked down upon, probably still are. Any major star in England had to change his voice. They do it in America to get on TV and radio, right? Well, that goes in England too.
I was 11 when all of a sudden, with a jolt, a change began to break out in the UK music scene. The UK media was suddenly realising we were making some of the best music in the world at the time and didn't need to be subservient to the music scene in the States. It had happened before in the 60s and it was happening again now in the 90s. Britpop was starting to emerge. Admittedly, it was a band called Suede from that same usual catchment area of London who were starting to make the very first waves, but those were the first signs of the coming flood that was about to overwhelm the entire nation. In 1994, an album called Definitely Maybe was released by a band called OASIS. The album was orange and I had it on tape, borrowed from a friend. And the band looked like ordinary people. They talked like ordinary people. They spoke with their own accents and were so unapologetic about it that they actually had to be subtitled when they were interviewed on American TV.
Why didn't you subtitle our last thing on MTV? Couldn't you understand the word we were saying?
You know what? This is the subtitles question again.
But I thought we were speaking quite loud and clear, actually.
No, it is loud and clear. See, I'm understanding every word right now.
As well as finding that hilarious at the time, I also felt a strange thrill of pride at how determined to be themselves they really were. The first words on their first single were, "I need to be myself, I can't be no one else," and it seemed that they were actually practicing what they preached. For the first time in my lifetime, there was a brilliant band in the charts who didn't look like anorexic aliens on a catwalk, but looked like someone I knew in my daily life. They dressed like people I would see around town, and they spoke like people I would hear down the pub. It was both surreal and exhilarating to realise that all of a sudden my world was in the limelight and people thought it was cool. And it seems I wasn't the only one who felt that way, because Oasis rocketed to the top at an almost comical speed. It was as if the whole country had been feeling the same way, that everyone we ever saw on TV came from the same little narrow cross-section of society, whereas most of us were just ordinary working class people who couldn't relate to all that crap. But now, all of a sudden, here was a band, and every single one of them was one of us. And what I'm saying there might sound strange to someone outside of the UK, but the truth is, the culture you usually see on TV representing Britain most of the time is just a very small element of culture in one city, middle-class London. And it does not represent the majority in this country, not even close. So when a band like the Beatles or Oasis appear on the scene representing the working classes, who are the overwhelming majority in this country, they really do tend to go supernova at an incredible speed. All the best bands in British music history always had fantastic music, but the very biggest had something extra, something that set them apart. They were leaders of a cultural movement. And in the wake of the massive success of Oasis came their cultural movement. It gets many different names, many different labels, and they all kind of overlap a little bit. Some people call it the Britpop movement, some people call it Cool Britannia, but as someone who was there at the time, I think the one that was the most associated with Oasis was called lad culture. Now, in the true tradition of the British working class being horrendously misrepresented and underrepresented by the powers that be, lad culture today gets a really bad rap. Listen to this from the Wikipedia article on lad culture. Lad culture is a British and Irish subculture initially associated with the Britpop movement. The subculture involves young men assuming an anti-intellectual position, shunning sensitivity in favour of drinking, violence and sexism. When you type in lad culture to Google, that is literally the first article that comes up. And it is basically, in my opinion, a massive stitch-up. It's writing off what was a really important, empowering movement for millions of people in this country as some bigoted, moronic army of cavemen. Working class people in all four British nations use the word lad to refer pretty much to any male. And look at what this article says about lads. They're all violent, drunken, sexist hooligans. It's an incredibly snobby, disparaging description of anyone from a working class background such as myself who identifies as a lad. And the reality on the ground, speaking as someone who grew up in the beginnings of that culture, always was very different. I grew up in a small terrace house in a tiny North Yorkshire town, and we never had any money. I used to go to school in charity shop clothes that didn't fit, shoes that were several sizes too big, flapping like canoes on my feet, and my hair cut by my mum very, very, very badly. I absolutely worked my arse off as an adult, so I can afford to go and see Liam at Nebworth next year, but we just never had any money when I was a kid, and I never got to see Oasis in their heyday in the 90s. We just couldn't afford it. But in a weird way, that didn't matter, because there was something magical about just seeing those five guys on TV with their northern accents, looking like ordinary people, talking like ordinary people, not giving a shit. For me, the dawn of lad culture was an isolated moment in British culture where the whole nation, just for a little while, seemed to be saying, if you are a penniless northern lad with nothing to your name except a battered old guitar and the songs in your head, you are the man. If you weren't there, it's hard to even imagine that today, but it meant so much. And in my lifetime, that message has gone out once, and for far too short a time. The Britpop years and the lad culture movement get misrepresented so badly because of who it is usually telling the story. Most of the time it's people who weren't really a part of it. Middle-class Londoners, detached academics, all people who weren't there and didn't experience the Oasis-inspired side of it from the inside. I was there. I was one of them. I was a northern lad in the first days of lad culture. And speaking for myself and my own experiences, pretty much everything that Wikipedia article said was wrong. I am not now, nor have I ever been, anti-intellectual. I'm actually just about to finish my masters. I consider myself a decent and affectionate dad and boyfriend. I do like a drink, but I'm certainly not violent and I'm certainly not sexist. Yet I am a lad, and I loved being part of that brotherhood when it all started. That lad culture movement in the 90s gave power and respect to ordinary working class boys and men who needed that encouragement. But since then, the term lad culture has changed to indicate some kind of bogeyman, some kind of absolute lunatic who I personally have never met. There is a reason that if you go for a night out in a proper down and dirty, grimy, working class area, 90% of the music you hear is guitar driven stuff. Whenever me and one of my bands play a gig in a really rough area, it's always a brilliant night out. And the reason for that is guitar music is still the sound of the British working class, and it has been since the Beatles. Despite being utterly neglected by the mainstream media, guitar music is still the sound of the British working class today. And that matters because we matter. There's a reason you don't hear very much rock and roll guitar music in the British charts today, and that's because the mainstream media have chosen not to represent us. It's not that there aren't guitar bands out there making great music. The opposite is in fact true. The problem is, it's never been more unfashionable to be a lad. The music that has gone hand in hand with working class culture since the 1960s has once again been driven underground. Representation is a massive part of why we need to get guitar music back in the charts. That's why I started my record label, and that's why I'm releasing music and learning how to release other people's music as well. That is the true meaning behind Hargreaves Records and the Take Back the Charts movement. It's not just about this kind of music is good and this kind of music is shit, even though that's true. It's more that this music is ours. This music represents us. It represents us, it belongs to us, it's the music we dance to in the pub on a Saturday night. It's the true sound of the British working class, and it should be heard. So what can we actually do about this in the real world, today, right now? That at least is an easy answer. Exactly the same thing we did back in the 90s. If you hear an up-and-coming band whose music you like, buy their stuff. And just to clarify, by that I'm not saying go and buy my single. If you want to, go for it. But that's not what this is about. What I'm really driving at is this. If you had a choice between, on the one hand, spending, say, £10 a month supporting great up-and-coming rock and roll acts in the UK, or, on the other hand, keeping your money but letting rock and roll collapse forever, what would you choose? Because by doing nothing, by choosing to be passive, by choosing to just take whatever we can get for free and give nothing back, we are choosing option 2. In this day and age where eventually you can get any music for free, we have to be aware of what message we are sending to musicians who need our support, who, with our support, could end up being the next OASIS. So I'm going to close this video with the same message I was given by the musical movement I grew up with, and the true lad culture brotherhood that I am still proud to be a part of. If you're a young lad growing up in the estates of, Newcastle, Belfast, Glasgow, Birmingham, you are the man. Don't listen to what the media tell you about being a lad, about being poor, about being working class. Be yourself and make no apology for that. You might be the one to spark the next revolution. Look at what OASIS did. They were just 5 ordinary blokes, and if they did it, you can do it too. And lads, we need you now more than ever.